Good morning in Washington. Good afternoon in Europe. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a terrific event for you this morning on recent events in Nagorno-Karabakh, and our speakers include Michael Sassiri, who's a senior policy advisor for the U.S. Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, Ambassador Robert Sakuda, who's a former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan and the president of Hudson Partners, Izmir Jafarova, who's a board member of the Center of Analysis of International Relations in Baku. We have Nursis Kapalyan, who's the associate professor in residence of political science at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. And we have Sheila Palin, international human rights lawyer, the former legal advisor to the United Nations. All right, we will start with a question for Ms. Palin. Azerbaijan conducted its recent military operation during the United Nations General Assembly Week, placing its actions and regional ramifications squarely in the global spotlight. This occurred even though negotiations between Baku and Yerevan have made some progress, and Prime Minister Pashinyan's government recognizes Azerbaijan's sovereignty in Nagorno-Karabakh. How do you interpret this action, and what is its impact on Armenian policy toward Azerbaijan and Turkey?
Thank you for the question, Ambassador Herbst. First of all, Pashinyan's government hasn't formally recognized Azerbaijan's sovereignty over Nagorno-Karabakh, but rather offered to do so as part of an eventual peace package. But on one non-negotiable condition, which is that Azerbaijan guarantee the rights and securities of the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, which Azerbaijan has clearly failed to abide by. So I also wouldn't say that Azerbaijan's choice of timing to launch its military operation during the UNGA placed its actions in this global spotlight, but rather served as a distraction. It was a bit distracting to do it that week, and I think that was kind of planned. It was to do so during that week was also a large measure of hubris. Remember, President Aliyev wasn't even there. He sent his foreign minister to claim before the whole world that Azerbaijan was determined to reintegrate ethnic Armenians of Karabakh. This is just days after Aliyev finished bombing those very same Armenians, forcing them to flee in the tens of thousands. Erdogan, by contrast, was at the UNGA and used a lot of his valuable speech time to declare that Karabakh is Azerbaijan and the Zangezur corridor is the inevitable next. So, such a stance can only negatively affect Armenia's policies towards Azerbaijan and Turkey. Those policies remain separate. The normalization of relations without preconditions remains Armenia's steadfast policy and position towards Turkey. But so long as Turkey continues to back and support Azerbaijan's hyper-aggressive and warmongering policies towards Armenians, there can't be any progress. In this way, Armenia's policies towards Turkey will inevitably be affected by Azerbaijan's aggressive policies towards Armenia, which in turn Armenia will have to respond with enhanced defensiveness. The peace talks are not working. They're backfiring. And so, Armenia is going to have to adjust and respond accordingly.
All right, thank you. Dr. Jafarova, Azerbaijan claims that it undertook this operation in response to provocations in Nagorno-Karabakh. Why did Baku act, and how does this fit in with the ongoing negotiations with Armenia?
Thank you very much for having me. First of all, Azerbaijan started this short counterterrorism operation against militias and separatist forces in Karabakh, which were creating security problems for its international recognized territories. On 19th of September, 6 Azerbaijani people, including military and civilian people, died as a result of landmine explosion, which were planted into the newly constructed road after Azerbaijan liberated its lands, which actually testified to the fact that Armenian forces were still infiltrating through the whatever roads to Azerbaijani territories and creating security problems to Azerbaijan. So we have been warning Armenia proper and also separatists that they have to leave as a result of the agreement reached in November 2020 However, Armenia still kept around 10,000 militias in the Azerbaijani territories, which were temporarily deployed by the Russian peacekeepers. And plus two military servicemen of Armenian Republic, they were also separatists backed by Armenia, who were creating problems towards Azerbaijan. So therefore, as a country which would like to protect its sovereignty, territorial integrity, security of its citizens, Azerbaijan took this very, let's say, short-termed. It was only like 24 hours, less than 24 hours. Military targets were only the targets that were subjected to the military operation. Only legitimate military targets were subjected. Also, the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, on 21st of September said publicly that there were no casualties among civilians. And I repeat, Prime Minister of Armenia himself said that there were no casualties among civilians. So I don't understand why there's so much hysteria and so much, let's say, speculations about this civilians being under attack, because he himself said, what can be the most reliable source of information, if not the Prime Minister of Armenia? So what Azerbaijan did after the separatists were disarmed, we actually confiscated all those armaments that were left behind by these separatists, and the international observers, including those that are in the country, military attaches, went to see all those armaments that were confiscated. By the way, Karabakh region of Azerbaijan is now characterized to be one of the most militarized regions in the world. Used to be, it's no longer. And we also give the chance of amnesty to the separatists once they lay down their guns. We also give free passage to the military servicemen of Armenia who came illegally to Azerbaijan territories to go back through Lachin-Khankendi road, as well as Kalbajar-Basar-Kechar road. So even for them, we are creating the conditions to leave after they demilitarize. What concerns the population of Karabakh, Azerbaijan has repeatedly said that we are ready to extend hands of support to them. They are our citizens, and their rights and security will be guaranteed under Azerbaijani constitution, as well as Azerbaijan's international obligations. And Azerbaijani authorities have already conducted several meetings with the representatives of Karabakh Armenians. First meeting happened 21st of September in Yevlax. Second happened in 25th of September in Khojaly. And third meeting is taking place today. And there are already results achieved as a result of these meetings. And Azerbaijani authorities have delivered humanitarian aid, all sorts of infrastructure assistance, fuel to these people because they asked for this aid through Agdam-Khankendi road. And there are medical evacuations happening. And Azerbaijan also enabled Armenia proper to use Azerbaijani airspace to come with their helicopters to deliver aid as well as medical evacuation if there is any need to this population. So we have also created an online portal for this population to acquire, if they want to acquire Azerbaijani citizenship, so they can facilitate all these procedures. And let's say if they would like to stay, they can apply for Azerbaijani citizenship. So you see, government is taking lots of steps in order to facilitate their stay. Certain reasons, there may be some ambiguity because they're not sure about the future, 30 years of war, they haven't lived together with Azerbaijan. Maybe some of them would like to leave. It's free choice. We cannot interfere with their freedom of choice. That's the issue. We are open to meaningful dialogue, provide their rights and security. What else Azerbaijani authorities have to do in these circumstances? You remember 30 years ago when Azerbaijanis were expelled from Armenia proper as well as Karabakh, they weren't given the chance to live in peace and preserve their dignity. They left everything behind, and they lived a life of refugees and IDPs for 30 years. And we're also expecting Armenia to take similar measures towards the refugees that fled Armenia 30 years ago and initiate the meaningful dialogue towards them, because they also have the right to return. So, you know, it's easy to blame Azerbaijani authorities because the idea of Miyatsum is over and Azerbaijan has restored the territorial integrity. However, we have to look at all the aspects of the issue and take, let's say, good measure of the good gestures, good wills of Azerbaijani authorities, that they are extending the hands of support. And I realize that I am in minority in this panel, so I have relevant disadvantage because there are more Armenian speakers than Azerbaijani speakers. So therefore, I expect the kind panel to give me more rights of response.
Thank you for your response. Well, we will take your views into full consideration.
Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Kapalyan, Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan made remarks in which he questioned the goals and motives of Russian peacekeeping forces in Nagorno-Karabakh. and suggested that they, along with Baku, would be responsible for the humanitarian crisis there. What role, in fact, have Russian peacekeepers and Russia itself played or not played in regard to this military operation by Azerbaijan?
Thank you for the question, Ambassador. As it became quite prevalent, Russia was initially informed of this operation, and this is an extension of what has become qualified as the Russo-Azerbaijani axis and their operations to consolidate Nagorno-Karabakh and to methodically allow for the eventual ethnic cleansing of the entire region, as we've seen. Baku's talking points have been consistently rejected by the empirical evidence, by the international community, as we saw at the UN. The condemnation was unanimous with the exception of one or two other authoritarian regimes. What we've seen is primarily Baku and Moscow collaborating to maintain the regional authoritarian orbit. And in that context, both have worked to deny the international community's involvement in the process. They have sought to localize it to engage in what we call authoritarian conflict management. And so any attempt to have, for example, the international mandates from the UN peacekeepers, from an observation mission, from international involvement, both Baku and Moscow had been adamantly opposed to those. So there's been a synchronized approach to addressing those issues. Furthermore, you have a crisis of credibility here. You have two authoritarian regimes whose word cannot be respected because they continuously violated. Aliyev's words are akin to the words of Putin. That's what nobody trusts Putin. But when we talk about, for example, Baku saying that rights and securities will be protected and that the Russian peacekeepers are here to accommodate that. Well, the question, of course, begs a set of observations that the empirical data completely reject. Azerbaijan is one of the most oppressive regimes in the world. The despotism is beyond question, whether we look at the U.S. State Department's own analysis, whether we look at all the literature out there by Freedom House, by every international metric, from Human Rights Watch to Amnesty International. So you have one of the most rigid authoritarian regimes in the world who don't even respect the rights and liberties of their own citizens, where due process is an inherent issue. And so where you have this collective culture of accrued despotism that defines an entire society, where Azerbaijan society itself is a victim, it becomes a complicated issue when you tell the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh they need to be integrated under a constitution that only serves the authoritarian elite. So this isn't an issue of integrating one people with another. This isn't an issue of Armenians and Azerbaijanis. This is an issue of a very, very despotic regime whose track record is basically consistently recorded by all international and objective actors. So this isn't simply an Armenian posture. I'm speaking as an academic, and the integration discourse basically seeks to address an issue that suffers from an innate contradiction, and that is the fact that integrating a society into an authoritarian system is inherently problematic. And so the Russian role in that context recently has been that Russian peacekeepers would accommodate or support the integration process. Well, the result has been the complete ethnic cleansing of the entire region. As of today, if I understand, nearly 90,000 Armenians have already left. You really don't have nothing much there. So this conversation that in a matter of days, people decided to pack up and leave, where they've lived there for a millennia, and this is an act of free choice, inherently contradicts the reality. It is incommensurate with the facts on the ground. And Russia played a very, very important role in accommodating this. We have seen synchronized behavior between Russia and Azerbaijan since the blockade of the Lachin corridor, an international condemnation that had been consistent. Russia's mandate, in essence, was not an exercise in protecting the population of Nagorno-Karabakh. Russia's mandate was to advance Russia's strategic interests in the region, and these interests obviously align with that of Azerbaijan. And so in that context, what we are seeing is Russia attempting to establish its authoritarian orbit in the region because it has lost complete control over Yerevan. And this has produced what many scholars are now starting to call the proxyization of Azerbaijan, where Azerbaijan is being utilized as a blunt instrument of Russian interest in the region to basically obstruct Armenia's Western pivot or the continuous democratization. So the role of the peacekeepers, to answer your question, is to precisely address and advance Russian interest as opposed to keeping the peace or protecting the population of Nagorno-Karabakh. As we've seen, it has been an abysmal failure. The peace process collapsed. The entire region is depopulated, and the peacekeepers failed to do their job. Most interestingly, of course, is that their inability or refusal to do their job is heavily consistent with Russia's policies. Approximately 3 weeks before Azerbaijan's attack on the population of Nagorno-Karabakh, we saw a well-orchestrated PR campaign by the Russian media and the Kremlin talking points. Investigative journalism by Medusa clearly stated this. They revealed how the Kremlin had provided talking points to begin attacking Armenia and blaming Armenia for what Azerbaijan was about to do. So contextually, the functionality of the Russo-Azerbaijani axis has been to maintain an authoritarian orbit. Armenia's position has been consistent. They have been very critical of the Russian peacekeepers and of Moscow's position, because it has been clear to everybody that the coordination between Baku and Moscow has been quite rigid and consistent. Now, with respect to the recent developments, Armenia's prime minister specifically stated that the day after the fighting, the civilian population in Stepanakert was not being attacked. But there was no statement saying there were no casualties. There are a lot of casualties. There are casualties on both sides. But the humanitarian casualties, the civilian deaths in Nagorno-Karabakh are extensive. And so denying that the fact that not a single individual died contradicts the obvious extensive data that we're seeing. So it's a question of empirics. It's not a question of he said, she said. But fundamentally, the peacekeepers not only failed their mission, this was a case of complete and utter strategic negligence, where they were not even set up there to succeed their objectives of protecting the population, but rather to advance Moscow's interests, which at this point have become fully aligned with Azerbaijan. So in that context, when we look at sort of peacekeeping from a scholarly perspective, what the Russians were doing was not peacekeeping. Their demeanor, their sort of coordination with Baku, their objectives weren't defined by keeping the peace or protecting the population. They were defined by the geostrategic interests of Moscow. So in that context, they were Russian forces, but they were not Russian peacekeepers. So I think when we qualify these developments through that lens, it becomes more obvious now that considering the sort of the innate structuration of the strategies of both countries, Azerbaijan and Moscow, the objective has been to maintain the authoritarian orbit in the region and to keep the conflict localized as opposed to allowing it to be internationalized. And so both have worked together to deny the international presence, and it has allowed them to engage in authoritarian conflict management.
Thank you. Dr. Jafarova, since Dr. Kapelyan went beyond just Russia, I'll give you 1 minute to respond, okay? 1 minute.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I do not want to criticize what Mr. Kopalian said is his point of view. However, attempting to draw parallels between Azerbaijan's attempt to restore its territorial integrity and fight terrorism and separatism within its internationally recognized borders with its alignment with Russia, that's utterly wrong and false. And remember, Armenia is the only country in the South Caucasus currently who is closely aligned with Russia, be it economically, be it politically. Despite all these flirtations that the current government is having with the Western countries, they are still the closest allies of Russia. Remember, they are also helping the Russian companies in Russia to avoid the sanctions. They are closest allies of Iran. So please do not try to divert the attention from the real focus of the matter and try to create here the image of Azerbaijan-Russia nexus, because there isn't one. So therefore, I really would to thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Vasa Sakuda. The US, France, and the EU have criticized Azerbaijan's military operation, but Baku received support from Turkey, the Turkic nations of Central Asia, and Russia in support. Is the support from Central Asia related to the Middle Corridor project for exporting goods from Central Asia via Azerbaijan to Europe?
Hi, Vasu, thank you. A couple of things I just want to say. I think, first of all, it's important to recognize the efforts the United States, France, the EU Commission, the EU presidency have been putting into trying to find peace between Azerbaijan, trying to find ways to bring the Azerbaijanis and Armenians together in the recent years, last 2 years. Frankly, a stepped up and much needed effort that was underway. And I think that Brussels and Washington are both owed some kudos for the work that they were doing. In terms of the Azerbaijanis in Central Asia, a couple things I might say. First of all, I'm not sure that the middle corridor was the root of the root of the diplomacy, that was really the key factor in that relationship. Certainly access to Central Asia is important. You know, Afghanistan is no longer an escape, no longer a route for trade out of Central Asia. Really, it was never really terribly good anyway because of the infrastructure issues. You got China on one side, Russia on the north. So it is important for the Central Asians to have that access to the West, and that means going through the Caucasus. But I think what was really more important here was a concentrated and frankly, I think effective Azerbaijani diplomatic initiative towards the countries of Central Asia. Yes, to a certain extent, building on the Turkic identity that comes from the past as sort of ethnic identity, and I know that may also be something that will be addressed by others on this program, but it really was a concentrated, ongoing, continuous effort by Azerbaijan to build support for its positions and to keep that support. I don't know any other way to say this than it was a diplomatic success for Azerbaijan. What's unfortunate is that there was not sort of another effort, I think, in some ways, by Armenia to sort of again reach out to these countries who had also been part of the former Soviet Union. I know there's a lot of discussion in the press and so forth about Christian versus Muslim and so forth. I spent a lot of time in my life working in Muslim countries. I'm not sure really the factor here. I think what really comes down to is a real effort by Baku to build understanding, support, diplomatic influence in the region, and other governments not taking advantage of that same possibility.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Sassiri, Turkey and Azerbaijan have also been interested in an economic corridor in the South Caucasus, and this is in fact dependent on an agreement with Armenia. How does the operation impact the possible project, as well as the prospects for normalization of Turkish-Armenian relations?
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst, and I'm grateful to be invited and join such a distinguished group. I should state that I'm speaking in my own capacity, and my views do not necessarily represent that of Congress or the U.S. government. With regard to the idea of a so-called corridor, often referred to as the Zangezur corridor by Azerbaijan and Turkey, this project really came about as envisioned as this idea of a contiguous route as part of this broader middle corridor project that was aforementioned by the last panelist, and this idea of a continuous trade route, but not only trade, an idea of an arc of economic influence, as well as potentially political and perhaps even security influence. And it's often been instrumentalized and verbalized in that sense as well. This idea that this is a continuous route of particular influence for Turkey, for Azerbaijan. I would agree that it's not necessarily a pan-Turkic or pan-Turanic idea itself, but it certainly has been laden with a lot of those ideas, a lot of those concepts in its propagation and its advocacy. With regard to how this operation, how this attack, how this violence affects that project, frankly, the way that I look at it and what is immediately concerning to me is not the prospects of a particular project for economic purposes, but my fears about renewed attacks on the undisputed territory of the Republic of Armenia. About a year ago, Azerbaijan launched military operations against the Republic of Armenia in undisputed Armenian territory in Syunik province. And as I understand it, Azerbaijani forces continue to remain in positions in undisputed Armenian territory. And the Azerbaijani position has been, well, border delimitation hasn't been successfully negotiated, and therefore you can't really say where the borders are. But I think from the broad view from the international community is that this is very much Armenian territory, and that those were very much abrogations of Armenian territory. And it was Secretary Blinken's intervention, as well as a cacophony of protest around the world, including from Congress, I think that really helped put a stop to that operation. So my concern right now, in the wake of this this disastrous conflict, and frankly, what appears to be ethnic cleansing in Nagorno-Karabakh, is that there is going to be a continued press for these maximalist and frankly irredentist claims against the Armenian population, against the Republic of Armenia. And when it comes to Syunik province in particular, you know, we're looking at a few things. We see a lot of the same signals that were sent in the advance of the attack against Nagorno-Karabakh that are also arraying against this idea of Armenian sovereignty over its own province of Syunik. And you know, for example, rhetoric about so-called Western Azerbaijan, about historical claims to this parts of Armenia. As I understand it, there's an Azerbaijani parliamentary hearing that's going to happen, I think, next week, that's examining the so-called legal aspects of its claims to Armenian territory. And so these send a lot of, I think, very troubling signals, not just to Armenia, but I think to the international community, and certainly, I think, to the United States, that Azerbaijan's intentions here are not entirely peaceful. And there are some more moderate signals that were sent in the most recent days, in particular around this project, when President Aliyev and President Erdogan met in the Azerbaijani exclave of Nakhchivan. I believe it was President Erdogan who said, well, you know, maybe if Armenia doesn't agree to this corridor, maybe we could do the corridor through Iran, which underlines, I think, is a more recent development as well about increased positive relations, a kind of thaw in Iranian Azerbaijani relations, which kind of occupies a bit of a sine wave in terms of amity and acrimony, and we seem to be heading towards I think a more friendly type of position. I think it was presidential advisor Hikmet Hajiev recently referred to those relationships as quote positive signals. So I think there is some discussion about you know, maybe pulling back from some of that more heated rhetoric. That said, you know, this hearing, as far as I know, is still planning to be held next week. There's still a lot of rhetoric coming from senior leadership, as well as, you know, more societally around claims to Syunik province. And I think, you know, given recent events, there's understandable fear that there's a propensity, or at least a plausibility of further attacks, and that needs to be taken seriously by the international community. What I will say about Turkey-Armenia normalization is that this project and the possibility of a direct route between Azerbaijan's mainland and Nakhchivan, and from there to Turkey, would be made incredibly simple by Turkey-Armenia normalization, and certainly by peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but a peace of a kind that is fully consistent with the international borders as the world understands it, and fully one that is made in good faith and kept to. And unfortunately, we don't feel like not all of us feel that there's really been a pattern of good faith when it comes to Azerbaijani intentions in the region. Thank you.
Thank you. We're running a little behind. Please try and keep your answers to no more than 3 minutes so we get to audience questions. So, Ms. Palin, we see tens of thousands of Armenian refugees heading towards Armenia from Nagorno-Karabakh, and there are large protests against the Pashinyan government. What is the domestic impact in Armenia of these events? Please unmute.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you for the question. Yeah, we've crossed the 90,000 mark now. There's still probably way more to come. And of course, people are shocked and very, very angry. In the first days when Nagorno-Karabakh surrendered, there were mass protests, but these seem to have died down for now, especially since the forcible the forcibly displaced Armenians started pouring in, there is a real sense of all hands on deck with this horrendous humanitarian crisis now. So even, the opposition doesn't seem to be making too much noise at the moment, which is a good thing. Sort of now is not the time. A lot of anger has also been directed towards Russia for obvious reasons, and the pivot west has really taken off. One of Pashinyan's most sort of face-saving, I suppose, statements earlier this week after anti-government protests really hit their peak involved declaring, that Armenia has no choice but to diversify its security architecture and to wean off of Russian dependence, and has every intention of ratifying the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court very soon, which will help enormously in seeking accountability for the enormous war crimes that are pouring into this country and are probably also soon to come. This move is, of course, not one that Russia is entirely thrilled with, given there's a standing arrest warrant against Putin. So Azerbaijan's military operation has had the domestic impact of at once, sowing further discontent among the Armenian people against the government, but then also sort of unifying them again. For the moment, things are volatile here, to say the least. Everything can change from one moment to the next. Armenians in Armenia are in the process of absorbing an enormous number of extremely traumatized Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. They're traumatized not just from being bombed and starved and permanently driven out of their indigenous homeland. They're not terrorists. They've never been terrorists. That's a very convenient statement to make. Being a separatist does not make you a terrorist. They have a right to bear arms in self-defense. Now they've been forcibly disarmed, displaced, and living under the looming threat of further bombs and war coming from Turkey and Azerbaijan. They are emboldened by impunity, but those tides of international apathy seem to be changing. The impact is multi-layered and emotions are, of course, running high.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Jafarova, I have a question for you, but I'll give you an extra minute if you want to respond to some of the other things that have been said. My question for you is, since Baku's operation in NK, has President Aliyev reached out to Prime Minister Pashinyan? And perhaps more importantly, how do you see the future of negotiations with Armenia and the bilateral relationship between the two countries?
Thank you so much. I think you should give me a bit more than 1 minute because it's 3 versus 1 in this panel. So therefore, I'll just try my best to keep it short and succinct as possible. So first of all, I want to reflect back to the issues raised by the previous speakers before coming to your question. Mr. Cecilia also said that Azerbaijan launched attack against Armenia's territories and there is some sort of Azerbaijani forces. Azerbaijan has intentions of occupying quote unquote Armenia, which is absolutely not true. And Azerbaijani authorities, Azerbaijani government has repeatedly said that we have no intention to occupy anyone else's lands. We just want to recover whatever was belonging to us and restore our territorial integrity, including Karabakh. And this is what happened. Nobody else here mentions that there are 4 United Nations Security Council resolutions adopted in 1993, which recognized Azerbaijan's territorial integrity and called for immediate and unconditional withdrawal of all Armenian forces from Azerbaijani territories. So I would like to remind this to the panelists. And also, Mrs. Pailan said in the beginning that Pashinyan didn't recognize Azerbaijan's territorial integrity, but he offered to do so. I'd like to understand what actually this is meant by, because there was an agreement reached on 15th of July in Brussels with the mediation of the EU that these countries, as a result of these negotiations, there was the declaration signed, and these 2 countries recognize each other's territorial integrity figuratively. 29.8 for Armenia, 29.8 for Armenia, 86.6 for Azerbaijan. These actually the numbers that these 2 countries possessed when they were part of the Soviet Union. So their administrative borders became their national borders. And the 2 countries recognized each other's territorial integrity within the borders that they existed during the Soviet time. So Pashinyan did indeed recognize Azerbaijan's territorial integrity, including Karabakh. So I wouldn't really throw around with such hypothesis that he didn't say though, so he just offered to do so, because this is not professional. And the matter of ethnic cleansing, several times the issue came up, so I didn't want to reflect on that, but since everyone repeated that, some of these people also have legal backgrounds, so I'm sure they know that throwing up with the legitimate legal terminologies like ethnic cleansing is not serious, if there is no genuine intent to kill these people are not living at gunpoint at their heads. They're leaving because some of them acknowledge the fact that they're leaving because the separatists are pushing them to leave. Some of them gave interview to Agence France Presse, and they said that, well, you know, we're pushed by separatists to leave. And others gave interview to Azerbaijani media saying that, well, you know, we don't want to leave because we live peacefully here, but there's lots of ambiguity here. So we don't know what's going to happen. Of course, it's their right to do so. So please be careful about such legal terminology. The other issue, I think it's Mr. Kopalyan who spoke about some sort of authoritarianism, etc. in Azerbaijan. I think this is ad hominem comment, and we would rather be refraining ourselves from making this personal kind of attacks against each other's countries. Remember, Armenia is the only country in South Caucasus where there are 99% Armenians living. There are no national minorities in Armenia. So please, when you speak about such things, just look in the mirror. And the other question, there are lots of them I'd like to reflect on, but you don't give me enough time, so I'll come back to your question. The peace treaty between Armenia and Azerbaijan, it's a long process, which was mediated and is still being mediated with the facilitation of the European Union. There were lots of hopes that the peace treaty could be signed last year. It didn't happen, but there are still hopes that it could happen this year. And European Union's mediation has been quite successful, I would say, including the US as well, because these two processes are complementary. So we are speaking very positively about the role of the EU and the US in facilitating the negotiations between the two countries. And there were, again, lots of hopes that this could happen this year. But the things that happened later, beginning this early September, when Pashinyan sent a letter of congratulation to the separatist regime, quote unquote, congratulating their establishment. And then the attack happened against Azerbaijani civilians and military in 19th of September, actually halted the entire process. But there are expectations that in October, there will be another meeting in Spain, and there could be some sort of agreement or framing agreement reached, because the draft peace treaty is already there. There are points that are being negotiated, concrete points that are being negotiated. And I think the parties were rather close to the agreement when they both recognized each other's territorial integrity, especially Armenia, because they were saying that, but they were never saying that like in very concrete terms, referring to Azerbaijan's territory in figurative terms. And they did so this July, 15th of July in Brussels. So I think it's a matter of time, and it's the matter of not really backtracking from the earlier commitments that were reached. What we are seeing in behavior, in Armenia's government's behavior, especially when it comes to peace negotiations, that there is a tendency to backtrack from the earlier agreed agreements. And that's actually what is pushing back the peace treaty. And I really hope that from now on, we will see more progress.
Dr. Kopalyan, since the 2020 war, Yerevan has been disappointed in and critical of Russian policy in the current crisis. Moscow has been supportive of Azerbaijan in this crisis. How do you see the future of Armenia's relationship with both Russia and the United States?
After the 2022 Azerbaijani invasion to Armenia proper in September, which became known as the German invasion, Armenia undertook a complete Western pivot. This has become very clear. Russia's threats against Armenia are consistent and daily, while Russia's relationship with Azerbaijan has become very, very strong. And the literature supports this, right? Authoritarian regimes tend to align with each other. Calling regimes authoritarian isn't a personal opinion, it's an international fact. The data speaks for itself. In that context, when you're a democracy, being surrounded by the authoritarian regimes, that creates severe complications. And so the Western pivot is fundamentally defined by a few factors. One, Russia fundamentally failed in its treaty obligations. And in that context, Armenia had no option but to diversify its security architecture. And the security architecture's diversification is a byproduct of it being constantly attacked by Azerbaijan. So this isn't an ideational movement. This is a movement of necessity, because the authoritarian orbit that is being established by Baku and Moscow is leading threats to Armenia's territorial integrity and to its sovereignty. In that context, Russia's consistent failures to recognize its responsibilities, both in Armenia and under the November 9 mandate in Nagorno-Karabakh, suggest that Moscow is no longer a relevant actor when it comes to fulfilling its obligations. It has a problem of credibility. In that context, the pivot is robust, and it's not some kind of an act, because it has created serious ruptures in the relationship. Yerevan and Moscow right now have very, very bad relationships, and Yerevan is heavily tilting west. Now, what is the future nature of the relationship? This is all contingent on the Ukraine war. If Moscow's defeat, as we see things proceeding, becomes more consolidated, a weaker Moscow will have a stronger basis to have a more cordial relationship with Armenia. A sort of a revanchist Russia, on the other hand, that has further ambitions of consolidating its peripheries, would lead to a much worse relationship between Armenia and Russia. In that context, the power structuration of Russia and its capacities post-Ukraine war is going to determine the way in which Armenia-Russia relations develop. But fundamentally, for the first time in a long time, we have seen the complete collapse of Russian soft power in Armenia. So this isn't just Yerevan's posturing. Armenian society has also turned against Russia. There's been a complete shift in political culture. And we saw this happen after the Post-Soviet Revolution, because, you know, democratic political culture really doesn't work with authoritarian political culture. And so the diminishing of Russian influence, both culturally and politically, has produced its consequences. And so this has triggered a pivot. In that context, we have seen immense growth and enhancement of U.S.-Armenia relations. We are seeing a lot of support from the United States in the realm of security coordination, training of officers, enhancing and improving Armenia's defense capacities. And the United States has shown a lot of interest in supporting Armenia's energy sector. Basically, the objective is to rupture the structure of dependency that Moscow had used the last 30 years, because that's what Russia does. It engages in neo-colonial behavior. So in a sense, U.S. objective has been to decolonize the South Caucasus from Russian influence, and Armenia remains the fundamental actor in that context. If Russia doesn't exercise influence and dominance over Yerevan, Russia's entire southern security architecture collapses. And so the U.S. intention in this context is aligned with that. And enhancing relations with Armenia is an important part of that process. So going forward, relationships with Russia is going to get worse, whereas relationships with the United States are going to improve. If Russia succeeds, in which this is what he's aspiring to do, with the regime change in Armenia, then this whole conversation is going to change. But as far as democracy sustains itself in Armenia, the pivot is becoming more consolidated by the day. And so the sort of the dichotomy between the reigning authoritarianism in the region and a democratic breakthrough and attempt to escape that orbit is shaping a lot of the discourse on this. And the United States has been also very clear on this. U.S. position has been, convince us of your democratic characteristics. And now the U.S. is convinced of that. Now the U.S. position is, convinced us that you have decoupled from Russia. And U.S. behavior is suggesting that they are also becoming convinced of this. And so this is inherently a process. But to answer your question, what is the trajectory going forward? Definitely relations with Moscow have been ruptured, and especially after the collapse of developments in Nagorno-Karabakh, which remained the primary tool that Russia had used consistently to leverage Yerevan, Moscow almost has no leverage against Armenia, which diminishes the nature of the relationship between the two. The economic components are always going to be there, but economics do not fundamentally define alliances or allegiances. So in that context, for example, Azerbaijan sells a lot of Russian oil. It funnels Russian oil. That in of itself doesn't suggest that they're best friends, for example. A lot of countries have had trade with one another. So economic trade isn't a sufficient basis to suggest that the trajectory of political alliance is going to proceed in the South Caucasus. So fundamentally, we are seeing a strong pivot to the West and a continued diminishing of relations with Russia.
Thank you. Okay. Master Sakuta, you already mentioned the efforts by the U.S. and the EU on the diplomatic scene. What role might they play now after this latest operation to ensure that the peace process is not derailed and that human rights are fully respected in the region?
Thanks for that question. I think, also building on the last set of comments, I think this is an important point to address right now. First of all, maybe it's very basic, but something I think that needs to be said. We're looking at a new chapter, but we are not working from a clean slate. And I think the conversations that, the remarks of those who've been speaking sort of show what needs to be addressed. Second thing I would say is the United States wants strong relations with all three of the South Caucasus countries, all three of the South Caucasus countries. And I would refer to President Biden's UN General Assembly speech last week, where he set out very clearly a basis for what the U.S. wants to see, basis for U.S. policy, territorial integrity, respect for sovereignty, and respect for human rights. All three of those are important and equally important. You can't trade off one against the other. And I think that, one of the first things that's sort of moving forward with the region now is, again, that reaffirmation of those principles. Respect for territorial integrity and respect for where the borders are. More concretely, or maybe more detail, if you and I were sitting back in Foggy Bottom and sending our papers upstairs to the 7th floor, I think the things which were set out for consideration right now, steps which I think the United States should be taking is, one, continue to help Armenia and Azerbaijan reach a peace agreement. That's the first thing. But a peace agreement does not equal peace. It's the basis for moving forward. So in that relation, coming from that point, second thing is to help Armenia and Turkey normalize relations. Conversations with Turkish officials, again, repeatedly show an interest in that. And I think there's also interest on the Armenian side. There's been a lot of progress on the Armenian position. Normalizing those relations is important. Normalizing those relations are important politically. They're important economically. They're important for the prosperity of Armenia. Third thing, do what we've done elsewhere in this world to turn a peace agreement into a real peace. That means helping reduce barriers. That means helping to reduce prejudices. And I think, again, looking at President Biden's speech in New York last week, he talked about what has happened between the United States and Vietnam. And John, you and I both remember, growing up during that period, how tough that relationship was, how deep the feelings in the United States were, and how they must have been in Vietnam. But we found ways forward. And as I've noted in conversations I've had with others, most of our closest allies are countries with which we had nasty wars, starting from the UK and Germany, France, Italy, Japan, Spain. You don't need to perpetuate the hatred. You don't need to perpetuate the animosity, but it isn't easy. And so specifically to try to find ways to get over that, to start moving this process forward and recognizing the very, very deep feelings on both sides, both among Azerbaijanis and Armenians, the deep suspicions on both sides of each other. I think first of all, the United States should be supplying humanitarian assistance to Armenia, given the refugee situation that is developing there, and given where Armenia's economy and sort of resources stand. Second thing is work on demining. I've spent years in the Balkans, Middle East. Demining is a long, very difficult process, and you can't have economic development. You can't have people going back until the demining is at least somewhat step forward. But it isn't going to be easy. If anybody's ever spent time on the old Maginot Line or the German-French lines in France, you still see signs when you walk along there, stay on the path, because mines are still around. It won't be easy, but something the United States can help with. Third thing, I think, is directly aid and indirectly through the International World Bank, IMF, other international financial institutions to help foster development in the South Caucasus, the whole of the region. We talked about a east-west corridor. It's not one road. It's that whole region, and integrating Armenia into that effort, something that has not happened. It really needs to. Finally, I would also sort of talk about looking at boosting regional trade among the countries of the region. And certainly that brings in Turkey, which is the economic powerhouse there. And then I think something which we may not want to think about too much, but is important, is curriculum reform in both countries. And that includes looking at the the textbooks, the way people have taught, really identifying themselves, developing a national self-image based on hatred of the other. That's got to be addressed. It won't be easy. None of this is going to be fast. It's taken us 50 plus years to get over what we did with Vietnam. Europe did faster after the Second World War, but I don't want to put anybody through that again. But there are steps the U.S. can take, and I think which we really need to be working on right now, and hopefully we can sort of get that through our own government. Thanks, John.
Okay, Michael. Prior to the 2020 war, Russia appeared to be the leading power, outside power in the South Caucasus. What has that war done and the latest military operation done to the relative influence of Russia, Turkey, and the U.S.?
Thank you, John. I think that for this question in particular, a lot has already been said about this topic, and in a lot of ways, I don't want to rehash some. I think the good analysis that's come out from some of the previous panelists that come before me. I will say, however, that the relative influence of Russia it's kind of in an interesting position. On one hand, I think it's clear that its influence has collapsed with Armenia. In many respects, but it still retains a great deal of leverage. And I think you can look at that dynamic and zoom out in the South Caucasus more broadly, and look at it in that way, where Russia has cultivated leverage points, not so much sought to develop relationships, not so much sought to develop even a traditional sense of influence, but really various pressure points that it can instrumentalize to further its own power in the region. I think it's done that with all three of the countries to varying extents. And to focus on Armenia and Azerbaijan, when it comes to Armenia, what it has achieved is carved out a very special role for itself by essentially abandoning its erstwhile treaty obligations and inventing some fairly convoluted and rather creative reasons for why it is not party to those obligations, or why it has not fulfilled its so-called peacekeeping duties in Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think looking at that in particular, it's fairly clear to me, at least, that Russia never had any intention of defending any country that it feels is in a strategic bind. Really, what it is interested in doing is furthering its own position, and is willing to instrumentalize the conflict, is willing to sacrifice Armenia, and is willing to sacrifice Azerbaijan to do that. At the moment that Russia appears to be interested in having a kind of Baku and Moscow condominium in the region, I think is more of a reflection of the fact that that Baku is in the upswing militarily and strategically. Whereas in the past, when Armenia seemed to have the military advantage, that was where Russia threw its lot. And so I don't think there's any mistake to that kind of dynamic. I will also say that we should, in that same vein, we should look at what has happened recently in terms of what Russia has done, detail by detail. A lot of the media typified the recent surrender as something like a Russia brokered ceasefire. But what really happened was Russia, Moscow, facilitated essentially the unconditional surrender of Nagorno-Karabakh and facilitated the dissolution of the de facto authorities there, and helped impose Azerbaijan's demands. Now, I think we on this panel can disagree on the merits of that, but it was not a brokered ceasefire. It was not something that, well, let's sit down, everybody, and come hash out some kind of a piece that's going to work for everybody. And this, I think, was just a more extreme version what was already a lopsided ceasefire in 2020. In terms of U.S. influence, I think some things we need to look at very, very clearly in terms of how we're going to approach this conflict, particularly in what we've seen over the past week. First, I think the United States, although we have increased our influence to some degree, I think that is brittle if we can't follow through, and we risk not being seen as bad faith by all sides if we're not willing to stand up for the principles upon which we've projected. And the State Department has gone on record saying we will not tolerate ethnic cleansing, and this administration has gone on record saying that that our policy is that the rights and the safety of Nagorno-Karabakh's ethnic Armenian population is paramount, and we're seeing the mass depopulation of that region. So I think first, I agree, humanitarian access and assistance is absolutely key, and not just humanitarian assistance to those refugees who have been displaced, although that's obviously very important, but also, as you know, to whatever extent it's still relevant, humanitarian access within the corridor itself, within Stepanakert, Khakhendi, itself immediately, because there's still not a great deal of visibility on what's going on there. And I think that's something we need to impress upon all of the parties in the region, particularly the Azerbaijanis, on achieving. And I think frankly, we do need to reassure Armenian sovereignty on some level, and find some mechanism, preferably an international mechanism, to help guarantee Armenian civilizational continuity and territorial integrity. Because whatever one's security assessment of the region right now, or what is to come in the next few weeks or the coming months, there is an understandable fear by the Armenian population and the Armenian government that they are in sort of the final legs of their civilizational existence. And I think for us to be able to show that we understand and that we're responsive to this catastrophe that's happening right now, we need to be able to step up and say, yes, we need to reassure Armenia's civilizational continuity and obviously its territorial integrity. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. We've almost run out of time. I'm going to take one audience question, and it's from John Roberts, who's a Atlantic Council senior fellow in London. It's the European Commission and Azerbaijan agreed in July of last year to double roughly Azerbaijani imports. However, Azerbaijan's seizure of control in NK and its exodus to more than half of its ethnic Armenian population is changing European attitudes. Pressure on the European Commission to reconsider the gas agreement with Baku is bound to increase. What are the energy consequences of Azerbaijan's control of Nagorno-Karabakh? And I'll give that to Ambassador Sakuda. I know he's done a lot of work on energy.
I don't frankly think that there's going to be much of a consequence there. I think the reality of life is this. One, while Europe is in a much better position than it was last year at this time in terms of its energy needs, it needs all the energy it can get, given Russia's continued invasion of Ukraine. And also, I think Russia's also proven itself to be less than a reliable supplier. It's weaponized gas, it's weaponized oil. It can't be really trusted as a supplier. So there's going to be a continued need for energy out of not just Azerbaijan, but the whole of Central Asia and the Caspian basin. I also think that this is one of the points, coming back to the president's remarks, and sort of when the relationship with Azerbaijan is always based on these three vectors: security, energy, and human rights. You can't really you have to address all three. And that's something that somehow gets lost. It gets lost in the press coverage of this. But I think that's a very basic thing which we should be doing, and we need to remember that triangle in our relationship. We also need to be realistic in terms of how much energy can be gotten out of any one country at any one time. And right now, it's the U.S., Russia, Saudi Arabia, they're the biggest oil producers, U.S., Qatar, Australia, Russia, that are the biggest gas producers. That's just the way the world literally is made right now.
Thank you, Ambassador Sakuda, and thank you all for participating. I realize you'd like to speak again, but we're already over time. Dr. Jafarova, next time we'll make this work. Okay, thank you all for participating, and we will be doing more work on the South Caucasus. Okay.
Thank you.